Hello, my name is Simon Swift and I'm a lecturer in critical and cultural theory at the School of English in the University of Leeds. And the title of this podcast is The Canon, How to Read Beyond Set Texts. So you've been set a series of books to read at A-level, and one of the big differences between A-level study and study at degree level is the amount of time that is given to each set text. That's to say, I remember back to my A-level and we took an entire term to read 2 books, whereas at university you might be reading 2 books in a week. So one of the great challenges to studying at degree level is working out how to develop ideas about these set texts when you're reading them so quickly. Fortunately, this isn't a problem that you have to worry about, at least for the time being. But it does mean that you have time to read more widely, to read more extensively around the set texts. And this is something that I think it's really worthwhile to be doing. The more well-read you are, the wider a sense of context you can give to the set texts that you're studying, the more intelligently and confidently you'll be able to speak about them in an exam situation. But how to set about reading beyond these set texts? How to set about reading beyond the canon? I've got 2 hints that I want to make in the podcast about this. And I'll outline them both very briefly and then go into more depth with the second one. Both of these points are connected though. The first thing to think about, and this is something that I learned at A-level, is to think about how canonical authors, the authors of your set texts, have influenced later authors and even filmmakers. So for example, there was a novel published in 1966 by an author from the Caribbean called The Wide Sargasso Sea. And the novel is by Jean Rhys. The novel is told from the point of view of a very famous, a character from a very famous 19th century novel, albeit that this is a character who doesn't have a voice in that 19th century novel. That is Bertha Rochester, the wife of Mr. Rochester from Jane Eyre. So The Wide Sargasso Sea is a kind of rewriting of a canonical English literary text, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And it seeks to give a voice to a character in Jane Eyre who doesn't have one. So Bertha Mason, the character, the principal character of The Wide Sargasso Sea, the voiceless character from Jane Eyre, is, as you'll know if you've read Jane Eyre, quite a terrifying, gothic and disturbing, quite animalistic character. She's locked away in an attic by her husband, Mr. Rochester. She is mad and he locks her away in the attic of his house, from which she attacks people in the middle of the night and threatens the woman that Mr. Rochester has fallen in love with and is planning to marry. That's to say Jane Eyre, the main character of this novel. But as I say, Bertha Mason doesn't have a voice in Jane Eyre. And the amazing work that Jean Rhys does in The Wide Sargasso Sea is to give a voice back to this character, to imagine how the world seemed to Bertha Mason, rather than just portraying her as a kind of terrifying, gothic, snarling beast. She's given a voice, she's given an identity, she's given a story of her own. So I suppose I'm suggesting that one of the ways in which we get to know great works of literature is by thinking about their impact, thinking about the ways in which they've influenced later writers. How have they left an impression on their readers? How have they influenced their readers? And can the way in which these readers reinterpret and rewrite the original tell us something about what was going on in the original text? Can we learn something about Jane Eyre by reading The Wide Sargasso Sea? So just over 10 years after The Wide Sargasso Sea was published, in 1979, a very famous, one of the most famous critical texts, Studies of 19th Century Literature, was published by 2 feminist critics called Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. And the title of this book is The Mad Woman in the Attic. It's a book which takes its title from Bertha Mason, the character from Jane Eyre. So you can see that Jane Eyre has had an incredible influence on later writers, both fiction writers like Jean Rhys and critics like Gilbert and Gubar. And I think it's worthwhile spending some time unpacking and unpicking what that influence might be, why it's had such a powerful influence, and how it communicates itself to later generations. And in particular, to notice what it is that those later writers pick up on in Jane Eyre. In this case, it's something really quite unexpected. It's not Jane Eyre herself, the principal character, the character who gives the novel its name. It's this marginal, silent, voiceless, quite terrifying character who has influenced later writers, both of fiction and criticism. I suppose to many later readers of Jane Eyre, both Jean Rhys and Gilbert and Gubar, Bertha Mason seemed to represent something of the condition of women in 19th century Britain, voiceless and hidden away. Bertha Mason became a kind of an icon for feminist readings of 19th century literature. But my point isn't really one about Jane Eyre and about Charlotte Bronte, but it's rather one about how in general we can go beyond the reading of canonical works, how we can extend our reading of the English literary canon. And I'm suggesting that by thinking about the influence that these canonical works have had on later writers, we can understand something about those works themselves, something about the original, about the canonical work. Are these works canonical? Are they assumed to have an intrinsic value because of the quality of their writing? Or are they canonical? Are they assumed to have a value because they seem to speak to later generations? Because they seem to articulate concerns of people who came after the novel? Or is it that we can see the ways in which they articulate those concerns because they're so well written? Is it a combination of those two things? Is it possible that in some sense canonical works of English literature, like Jane Eyre, contain a kind of knowledge that the author may not necessarily intentionally have put there? I've talked about this in a previous podcast on the death of the author and the idea of biography. Is it possible that Charlotte Bronte, living in Yorkshire in the early 19th century, was able to articulate a set of concerns about women's place in society that were then taken up by later critics? Did she know that she was doing that? This is my question. Was she aware in some sense that she was opening up a space for an analysis and an engagement with the condition of women in 19th century society? Or is this something that she can't be considered to have intentionally put into her text? Could it even be that the text is great because it contains something, a kind of knowledge, that the author didn't put there herself, didn't know she was imparting through her text? And of course, this way of reading the canon, or rereading the canon, thinking about the ways in which great texts have been reinterpreted, isn't confined to Bronte and to Jane Eyre. You could also think about the film adaptations that have been made of Shakespeare plays, from a film called The Throne of Blood by the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, which was made in the late 1950s, through to Baz Luhrmann's film Romeo and Juliet in 1996, and films since then. What is it about Shakespeare that makes him adaptable to the big screen? What can we tell about the ways in which these adaptations are made? What might they tell us about the original work itself? So this is the first piece of advice I've wanted to give you in this podcast about reading beyond the canon. To think about adaptations of originals. And rather than thinking of them as distortions or appropriations of the original, think of them as having the capacity to tell us something about that original, something that was there in the first place, in the canonical work itself. The second piece of advice I want to give is related to this first piece of advice. If you want to read beyond the set texts on your A-level, if you want to read beyond the canonical works that you're being introduced to I think it's worthwhile to think about the fact that great writers are often also great critics. Not always, but often. So one of the most important pieces of advice I give to incoming undergraduate students concerns how to read and how to work with secondary sources, critical sources. And I always say to them when they're preparing their first essay at university, once you've finished reading the set text, remember that we're reading set text very fast at university level, rather than immediately going off to read the critics and getting their views of the set text, reread the set text. It's more important to have read the set text at least twice than it is to quickly move on and find someone else's view of this text. You'll be amazed how much more you see into the text at second reading. So rereading is much more important, I think, than secondary criticism. And once you've really got to know the text in this way, then you can come on to look at the views of critics and compare them to your own and think about how they interact with your own very knowledgeable and informed view of the text. But even before going off to look at this secondary criticism, once you've read the primary text 2 times, maybe even 3 times, it would be worthwhile thinking about the fact that great writers are often great critics, and seeing if the author of your text, your set text, has written about their own writing in a critical way. One of my favourite poets is T.S. Eliot, from the early 20th century, early to mid-20th century, the author of The Wasteland from 1922, which is one of my favourite poems. So Eliot was a writer of fantastic poetry, but he was also a great critic in his own right. He wrote very lucidly and clearly about other poets, and also in some ways about himself as a poet, as a creative artist. You can learn a lot about Eliot as a poet by reading his criticism and thinking about him as a literary critic as well as a poet. Eliot wrote a very famous essay in 1919, so 3 years before he published The Wasteland, which is called Tradition and the Individual Talent. I'm going to read you a passage from this essay, 2 passages in fact, and then talk about it a little bit, to think about this idea of reading beyond the canon, and indeed to reflect a little bit on what the canon is. Not only the best, but the most individual parts of a poet's work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. In the second phrase from this essay, he says, "No poet, no artist of any kind has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists." So in a way, Eliot is writing about the canon here. He is writing about the sense that great writing is not something that just grows up in isolation. It's not just the spontaneous product of a great writer's mind. It's not just simply the work of a genius or the product of inspiration. That greatness and even the individuality of the work, the individuality of the author's talent, are a product of this slightly spooky, slightly disturbing relationship that Eliot is describing between the living author and the dead poets. The claim, and this is quite a strange one, is that the moments in which the author speaks most authentically in his own voice are also the moments in which his ancestors, the dead poets, assert their immortality most vigorously. It's a really strange claim that the originality of a great work inheres in its ability to wake up the voices of the dead, so that a great work is at once original and also an inheritance, a waking up, a kind of evocation of the voices of the previous generations of critics. Eliot's is a claim about the canon, about canonicity, and about the ways in which new and original work interacts with a whole tradition of poets in the English language. And it changes the relationship between those different poets. It reconfigures them. In some sense, it brings them back to life. It gives new and unexpected meanings to them. So Eliot seems to be saying something that is quite contradictory, that what he calls the individuality of the literary work, the individual talent that makes it unique and original, is in fact on some level the work of other hands, that it is the dead who are speaking through the individual talent. This seems to me to be quite an extraordinary thing to say, that what makes something unique, that what makes something really itself, is the fact that other voices speak through it in a profound and original way. It seems to undo the kinds of oppositions that we might presuppose, that we might hold in our heads, between, on the one hand, tradition and inheritance, and on the other, individuality, or between the past and the present, or between, on the one hand, the self and the other. Eliot seems to be saying, on behalf of the poem, that what makes me most myself is the way in which I allow others to speak through me. Quite a strange and contradictory claim to be making. But in a way, this is what I've been talking about all the way through this podcast, by thinking about the notion of literary adaptation, the ways in which later authors and filmmakers, like Jean Rhys in the case of Charlotte Bronte, and Akira Kurosawa, or Baz Luhrmann in the case of Shakespeare, rework, reinterpret original texts, wake them up again in some sense, make them present and contemporary, and perhaps even show us things that were latent in the original, but that we may not have thought about, that we may not have noticed, like that madwoman hidden away in the attic in the case of Jane Eyre. So just to conclude, the most important thing to do is to read the text itself again, maybe 2 or 3 times, so that you really get to know that text. And then the next thing to do, if possible, if this exists, is to find some critical writing by the author themselves. So if you're interested in reading T.S. Eliot, or if you're reading T.S. Eliot for your A-level, then go and read his essays, like Tradition and the Individual Talent. And then you might also at that stage want to read adaptations, versions of the text that you've been reading, rewritings of it. And only then, really, does criticism come into the frame, for me at least, when you're very informed and you really developed your own ideas about the primary text. Then it's time to look at the interaction between those ideas and the ideas of others. Thank you.